In a quiet suburb outside Bucharest, a famous woman sits alone in a room she's afraid to leave. The phone keeps ringing. She already knows the voice on the other end, and she already knows what it will ask for. More money. Another envelope. And if she says no this time, the voice has promised her something far worse than going broke. She is one of the most recognizable faces on Romanian television. By the time investigators finish counting, she will have handed over more than $500,000 in cash and property to two women she met when her life was falling apart. The two women never threatened her with a gun. They never sent anyone to her door. What they held over her was something no court in Europe had ever figured out how to prosecute. Because in Romania, there's a kind of power that doesn't show up in any police file. A power that has rattled presidents, drained bank accounts, and once made grown lawmakers vote against their own law out of pure fear. This is the story of a criminal network that didn't need weapons because they had something better. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Romanian government was, for one strange and bizarre stretch, sincerely afraid of being turned into toads. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Land That Never Stopped Believing. Chances are, when you picture Romania, your mind goes straight to one thing: Dracula, vampires, the medieval prince whose legend gave the world its most famous monster. But the folklore here never stayed locked in the history books. It stayed in the culture. It stayed in the bloodstream. Consider this. The country's own president and his aides were known to wear the color purple on certain days, supposedly to protect themselves from evil spirits. This wasn't some teenager. This was the head of state. So when something dark moves through a place like this, it doesn't get laughed off. It gets believed. And belief, it turns out, can be sold. For generations, Romania has been home to a community of working witches. Most of them are Roma, an ethnic minority pushed to the edges of European society for centuries. Locked out of ordinary jobs and ordinary respect, some of these families built an entire economy around the one thing nobody could take from them: the fear of the unknown. Tarot readings, love spells, curses lifted for the right price. To outsiders, it looked like harmless fortune-telling, a bit of theater for the desperate and the heartbroken. But inside some of these operations, something colder was taking shape. And the first real sign of it didn't come from a back alley. It came from one of the most glamorous addresses in the country, because their best customers were never the poor. Chapter 2. The offer. When a new client first walks in, the price is almost nothing. A small fee for a reading, a little something for a candle. Investigators who later studied these cases noticed a pattern, and it's the same one used by every good con in history. They start cheap. They build trust. They make the client feel understood in a way no one else in their life has bothered to. Then, slowly, the price climbs. Because by then, the client isn't paying for a service anymore. They're paying to stop something terrible from happening. Which brings us back to the woman in the mansion. Her name is Oana Zavoranu, a soap opera actress and one of the most famous celebrities in Romania. Around 2011, her marriage was collapsing, and she was terrified of what a divorce might cost her. So she did what a lot of frightened, wealthy Romanians had done before her. She went looking for someone whose power the lawyers didn't have. She found two women who went by single names, Melissa and Vanessa. At first, they promised to help her through the divorce, to smooth the path, to protect her. And for a while, she believed it was working. But what she didn't understand was that she had just stepped onto a ladder with no way back down. The moment she became dependent on them, the relationship quietly flipped. They weren't working for her anymore. She was working for them. And when the threats finally came, they had nothing to do with magic. What these two women held over her was the thing every famous person fears more than any curse. And the day they said it out loud, she realized there was no getting off the ladder at all. Chapter 3. But how do we know any of this? Here's the obvious question. If all of this happened behind closed doors, in whispered phone calls and private rooms, how does any of it end up on the record? The answer is that one day the victims stopped paying, and they walked into a police station. In December 2011, Romanian authorities did something that sounds like it belongs in a fairy tale. They arrested two self-professed witches on charges of blackmail and extortion. A police spokesman named Christian Ciocan laid out exactly how it worked. The women approached public figures, offered to fix their troubles with love, money, or bad luck, and charged almost nothing at first. Then they raised their prices as the victims got hooked. And if a client ever tried to walk away, the women had two moves. They would threaten to cast a spell, or they would threaten to expose the client's most private secrets. That second threat is the one that did the real damage. Zavaranu says she handed over more than $500,000 in cash and property before it stopped. The spells were the marketing. The blackmail was the business. And this is where the story stops being merely strange and turns quietly unsettling, because this wasn't one rogue pair of con artists. The arrests cracked open a much bigger picture. A loose network of families operating across the country, running the exact same playbook. And some of their clients weren't soap stars at all. Some of them sat in government. Chapter 4. The Curse War. To understand how deep the fear actually ran, you have to look at what the government did that same year when it made one simple decision. It decided to tax the witches. On January 1st, 2011, Romania officially added witchcraft to its labor code. For the first time, witches and fortune-tellers would owe income tax, just like any other worker. On paper, it was a dull little piece of tax policy. What happened next was not dull. Witches traveled from across the country to the banks of the Danube. There, they hurled a poisonous plant called mandrake into the water, casting a mass curse on the president and the entire government, so that, in their own words, evil would befall them. One of the most feared was a woman named Bratara Buzea, in her 60s, who had survived being jailed for witchcraft decades earlier under Romania's communist dictatorship. Her chosen curse reportedly called for cat excrement and a dead dog. Another witch's family was filmed brewing a potion out of cat waste, aimed squarely at the people who wrote the law. You would expect a modern European government to shrug all of this off. It didn't. When lawmakers later drafted a tougher proposal, one that would force witches to issue receipts and be held legally responsible for predictions that didn't come true, the Senate voted it down. And one of the politicians behind the bill said something that still stops people cold. He claimed his fellow lawmakers killed it because they were afraid of being cursed. Sit with that for a second. Elected officials in a European Union country quietly voting against a law because some of them truly feared what the witches might do to them. That fear was the entire product, and the people selling it were about to prove it had no expiration date. Chapter 5. The thing you can't arrest. So what happened to the two women at the center of it all? They were detained, charged, and ordered to wait for trial. The headlines raced around the world. Witches, police, blackmail, celebrities. For a moment, it looked like the spell had finally broken. But here's the part nobody likes to sit with. Arresting two women did nothing to the thing that made them dangerous in the first place. The network of families kept working. The readings kept happening. The desperate kept knocking. Because you cannot put handcuffs on a belief. Years later, in 2019, a group of Romanian witches was back in the news, this time claiming to curse politicians they called corrupt, mixing an enchanted substance to fling at the government building right before an election. The act hadn't ended. It had simply found a new stage. And that's what this whole story is really about. It was never about magic. There's no evidence a single curse ever worked, no proof any spell changed a divorce or struck down a senator. What these families understood, better than any traditional mafia ever did, is that you don't need a weapon if your victim is willing to wound themselves with their own imagination. They were selling people's fear back to them. The actress, the senators, even the president in his purple shirt. Every one of them supplied the power themselves. The two women from the beginning slipped out of the headlines. The $500,000 was, for the most part, gone. And somewhere in Romania tonight, in a small room lit by candles, someone frightened is sliding an envelope across a table, paying to keep a curse away. The oldest racket in the world, and the one thing the law still hasn't found a way to stop. If you want more stories from the dark corners of history, the places where fear quietly becomes currency, stick around. There's a lot more down here in the shadows.